All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the MindMate podcast. I have a very special guest with me here today, Kathleen Higgins, all the way from Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic. There's so many things that I want to ask you, Kathleen. I think, like I said to you before we started recording, listening to you, I think it was a debate on Nietzsche versus someone who was
Oh, Dostoevsky?
correct. Yes, yes.
Yes.
That was really good. That was really good. And I think like as every productive philosophical debate goes, it's not really debate, more an exploration of ideas, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that was a fun one because initially I thought it was going to be, I'm representing Nietzsche and he's representing Dostoevsky, but really we were talking about just what interesting characters they were and what their overlaps and non-overlaps were.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, how about we just start there? What are some of their overlaps? What are some of the similarities? What are some of the differences between the two?
Well, I think both of them thought that the modern world was suffering from a crisis in values. They ended up not overlapping in that Dostoevsky thought that a return to a kind of basic Christianity would be the best way to go, and Nietzsche thought that might be almost the worst. I mean, he was much more interested in religion evolving and being less focused on theism, and so that was one difference that they had. But also their kind of personal oddities, being writers and rather introverted people, made them have a certain amount of sympathy, I suppose, for each other. And Nietzsche did have sympathy for Dostoevsky. I mean, before you got to the happy endings of some of his analysis, he thought Dostoevsky was really very astute in analyzing people's characters and motivations. So what they wanted to focus on in stories about human beings was kind of similar too.
Am I right in saying that Dostoevsky was one of the only sort of philosopher writers that Nietzsche admired?
No, he admired a lot of people. It's just sometimes he admired and disadmired the same people. And Nietzsche writes in a very moody way. I mean, some people write to kind of preserve the edifice of their way of looking at the world, and they want everything to be consistent. Nietzsche couldn't care less about that. So, depending on what he was focusing on, he might say Spinoza is like the one real precursor I've ever had. But other times he thinks, well, intellectual love, what is that? That doesn't make any sense. So, intellectual love of God sounds completely bloodless and lifeless. Um, and he could say both things, you know, in some ways saying something possibly important to consider if you're thinking about Spinoza, but those aren't going to go together very naturally.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I haven't read too much of Nietzsche. It's partly the reason why I wanted to speak with you so desperately. But I remember reading Beyond Good and Evil about 5 years ago when I was living in France at the time. And just it was so interesting to me because I'd never really read a book like it. It wasn't even almost a book. It was just like a series
Mm.
of aphorisms or statements almost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in his case, I think some of that he came to because he had migraines. So a lot of times there were sort of limited spurts that he could work. And I think that led him for a while to write rather short, sort of sprint like passages and then set it down and then arrange later on. I think that's how he started. I think he came to see that as actually a benefit and form for the kind of thing that he wanted to do.
Right. That makes a lot of sense now. And yeah, it's a fascinating read, no matter who comes along to it, really. I think it reminds me of that Hemingway quote, like your goal as a writer is just to write one true sentence. Just whatever you can do, write one
Mm.
true sentence. And I remember reading that in France, like I said, and there's like 50 sort of porthole exploration, mind-bending statements. Like I remember a specific moment. I can't remember exactly what the quote was, but I read it and I just sort of looked up and I was like, I can't never, I can't now unsee that. Like that's true.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that is one of the things that I've found most intriguing about him.
So, because you've written extensively on Nietzsche for decades now, so what initially brought you to him?
I guess the fact that I had heard from somebody else that I admired in high school that he was reading Nietzsche, and I thought, well, this guy's reading Nietzsche, it must be the thing to read. And I started reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and within about 3 pages, I could make no sense of it at all. And it's kind of put it down for a couple of years because it's not clear whether this is supposed to be sort of like cartoon Never Never Land, or um, is this someone who we're supposed to take seriously? Is it intended as absurdist? I just didn't know how to see that. Zarathustra encounters a saint who is praying to God, and he doesn't talk about his own views about God being dead, but after leaving him, he thinks this saint doesn't realize that God is dead. And it's like, what is this? Like, well, probably most of your readers don't either. So part of it was just stubbornness. Coming back to Nietzsche, I picked up something else by him. Actually, I was looking at some of his letters, and I found the personality that was behind this a really pretty intriguing guy. And after that, I gave it a go again and read quite a few books in rapid succession, just finding them really intriguing. And yeah, you're always going to be surprised. And I find that even having read the books over and over again, there's always some other possible way of taking some of these, amazing sentences. And that starts making me think, well, if this means that, then maybe I should reinterpret all these other things. So
Right.
it's endlessly entertaining. I will say that.
Yes, yes. And I think a lot of people, especially on social media now, it's certainly how I came to know Nietzsche, that they associate him with the idea from the book, thus spoke Zarathustra, which is God is dead, right? But
Mhm.
it's like almost like he was sort of standing on the precipice of the modernism movement and sort of looking and seeing what was going to occur. What are some things that we don't know about Nietzsche that we really should, perhaps about his personal life or about some of his other ideas that really should have seen more of a wider audience, but haven't anything?
Well, I think that from the fact that he says God is dead, one way of interpreting that is to think that he thinks one ought to do away with everything religion has had to offer. But he was actually going to major in theology as well as classics to begin with. And I think that it was actually majoring in theology for a little while that led him to reconsider the whole thing. His father had been a minister, his grandfathers both had been ministers. Um, and very likely that was the destiny he envisioned himself having. But he was reading all these historical analyses of Jesus and what could have historically been accurate and how much was mythology. And I think that was just mind blowing to him. There was theologians, in fact, that were in effect saying much of this account that you believe is history never happened. And if it's the theologians saying
Wow.
that, where are we? So I think that aspect of his background is important. And part of what I think that indicates is that in a way, he thought like a Christian, but a Christian who has lost faith. And
Right.
I think that the way in which Christianity still figures in the way he thinks and writes about various themes sometimes is underappreciated. And he clearly has a very robust awareness of passages in scripture. So he alludes to them very frequently. And I think sometimes those are missed by some of his enthusiasts who don't necessarily quote chapter and verse.
Right. That's really interesting. So I think it's like, just correct me if I'm wrong, it's so important that when we read Nietzsche, not to conflate this idea of God is dead with we should throw or the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to religion in its entirety, as opposed to what he's really saying is just we're losing a value structure that unifies us all together, and I'm not necessarily sure what that's going to do.
Yeah, I mean, he thought that. I think he also thought that the value structure had been so much of a monolith that controlled the way
Right.
people thought, that it was really a good thing if that ceased to have control over people. But he worried that a kind of scientific worldview was starting to be treated as the same kind of authority structure that one couldn't deviate from.
Mm.
And one of the people that most influenced him, in fact, in his theological studies, was Feuerbach, who had argued that humanity had put its own most important traits, projected them out into God, and ended up, in effect, vilifying themselves by virtue of this kind of mega perfect idea. Um, and really, that what that did was really alienate people from their own potential. So Feuerbach thought that if we reincorporated some notion of the divine into human potential, that might give us another kind of religion that would be much more anthropocentric, but anthropocentric in a good way, because it would view humanity's nascent divinity as something that we ought to encourage.
Hence the rise of the Übermensch idea, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, I think I mean, that's actually one thing that I certainly think a lot of people don't recognize, because the Übermensch sounds like, here's the great hero,
Right.
and the Übermensch will control everything, and, bye bye humanity. I mean, in some ways, that's the way Zarathustra talks about it in the very short passage where Zarathustra describes the Übermensch, but almost always in metaphorical terms that are very hard to interpret. But I do think that the idea of the Übermensch, as he understood it, was certainly to be a kind of future development from humanity. And is it going to be a different species entirely? I mean, he used
Wow.
evolutionary metaphors too, so maybe he thought that. But I think that a lot of people miss the idea that it's trying to develop our own potential that would lead toward this greater future.
Right, right. Which is really interesting because, like, I see a lot of this in my work as a therapist, and
Mhm.
like I was telling you before, I love the existential stuff, where because so many more of us, and myself in my personal life, especially in my 20s, are sort of not necessarily debating, but questioning the values and the morals that have been, I suppose, given to us by the previous generations. And I was raised a Catholic, but nothing too too intense, I suppose. And I was listening to a lot of these ideas in a literal sense and not really getting a whole lot of it. And then, you can't help but take on the worst case scenario of what a hell is when you're a child. And that sort of pushed me away from a lot of it. And then we come to this place now um, where you're sort of thinking about, well, how should I live? And science tells us how things work, and what is in the world, but not necessarily how to act and how to have a good life. And I noticed that when people start to think about actualizing their potential, it is individualistic and egocentric by definition, but there seems to be this sort of pull away from um, the values that we can gain from community and being sociocentric and all this sort of stuff. So, do you think that with some of Nietzsche's ideas, perhaps you could expand on this in how you view these ideas yourself? But do you think that you're always going to get that necessary tension between sort of building yourself up, but then also feeling like you're pulling away from other things too? How do we sort of balance those two aspects?
Um, you mean pulling away from tradition? I mean the continuity of generations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and but also even, I mean, even the sort of community benefits that a church provides or a religion provides, I
Oh,
find that
right.
working with a lot of people, they want to walk this path now of actualizing their potential, but it's so individualistic, they start to feel lonely.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's quite quite reasonable. And I'm not sure Nietzsche's the best guide for how to have a thriving social life. He actually had more of one than sometimes meets the eye, because there were a number of people that he hung around with in Italy when he would go to Italy in the summers. But he certainly spent a lot of time alone. And even though he was a very kind of mild-mannered social presence, um, by himself, he would write things that, would be things like, "I am no man, I am dynamite."
Mm.
So there, I mean, there are obviously two sides, and I think the side that he took to be himself was the writer writing these outrageous statements. Although another thing about him as a writer is that he qualifies what he has to say. So he'll say something really outrageous, but elsewhere he'll problematize exactly what he said. And this maybe isn't true right before his collapse.
Right.
Then he was kind of nonstop megalomaniacal in some passages, but still, I think that he couldn't have not been aware. I mean, yeah, he must have been aware that he had um, kind of extremely different perspectives on things. And I think what he wanted to do is point out that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because you can learn from all of these perspectives. And the mistake is thinking that one of them is really the correct perspective. So he took what was, possibly a physiological problem. He may have been, by today's way of rendering it, bipolar. I mean, it seems like he probably was,
Yeah.
at least to some degree, but he tried to capitalize on that fact, even though I think many times he saw this as rather tragic himself.
Right, right. It's interesting you mentioned bipolar. I remember reading a study that found like a pretty significant correlation between bipolar specifically as a mental health condition and openness to experience. So, the creative types, obviously. And you certainly see that with Nietzsche's writings, as you said, just these wild statements that seem to come from nowhere. You can only imagine what it's like to have a mind like that that just sort of bounces you around constantly. And, you can think of people like Kanye West and all that sort of stuff, that people who live on the outskirts of society and look at it and have these wild ideas that can either rejuvenate it or ruin it, But
Maybe both.
probably both, exactly. But Kathleen, you said something interesting to me before. You said that you're sort of discussing how Nietzsche viewed himself, whether as he was the Nietzsche, the writer, and the introvert, or Nietzsche, the societal man. I
Mhm.
wonder, because philosophy in itself is a sort of introvert's um, art form, or however you would describe it, do you think that a lot of these ideas just seem to work better for introverts? I mean, you don't see extroverts, writing alone by themselves almost by definition. So I don't know. I'm trying to think as to how we could put a scientific perspective on that.
Well, I do think, I mean, there probably is a greater number of introverts, proportionate to their incidence in society among philosophers. But it's not that they're all introverted. I mean, some people write in a very extroverted way. I mean, it's just a kind of continuation of their extroverted persona toward the world.
Mm.
A friend who's a law professor, writes a lot, but I think that it's, part of his sociability. And actually, I think for a lot of introverts too, it's part of their sociability. So it is a relating to other people. It's just relating in a way that is more manageable in terms of what's draining to them individually. So I think it's kind of complicated.
Yes.
Um, and there are extreme cases. And I think Nietzsche maybe was a little more extreme than some in that I think that he really felt most at home with himself. But maybe that's an exaggeration. It's just that he spent an awful lot of time alone. So I would have to hope that that was the case because otherwise much of his time would have been fairly frustrated.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. Well, so okay, so you said that there was a guy that you liked, and he was reading Nietzsche, and that sort of pulled you into to reading Nietzsche. Was that then what inspired you to pursue a career in philosophy, or was that always something that you felt called to, perhaps even from a young age?
Well, yeah, that's a complicated question. In one sense, retrospectively, I came to realize that a lot of things that interested me were philosophy. And in fact, an English teacher in high school, when I wrote an essay, we were supposed to write about something that interested us. And what interested me was that a building had the inscription, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."
Hmm.
And he kind of pulled me aside and said, if this is what you're interested in philosophy. So, oh, well,
That's
that kind of makes sense. So in that sense, that was probably, already there. And even when I was in elementary school, Dominican nuns who would talk about Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, Aquinas's hero, whenever they would bring those figures up, I would find whatever they were saying really pretty fascinating. So
mm,
I think that there was a strong interest long before when I was a senior in high school.
right, right. Yeah, it's sort of the reading Nietzsche sort of sparked something that was probably already there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool. And tell me where your philosophy career has taken you. I mean, we've spoken a lot about Nietzsche, but what have been some really formulative ideas, writers, people? Yeah,
Ah, well, in college, because I was interested in kind of everything and thought of philosophy as a big umbrella
right.
under which you could consider everything. I actually didn't major in philosophy, though I sort of minored in it. I majored in music
Hmm.
and thought thinking about music was playing music was really fun, and thinking about it was really fun. So some of my writing has focused on music in relation to often other things like ethics. Um, People often in societies see music as really vital to having a society, bringing people together, expressing what the society really values. And I found that really interesting. But also because the last year I was in college, I took a class on the music of India. I was just blown away by the fact that there's this other completely elaborate way of structuring music that was quite different from what I had been learning in the conservatory. And so the what aspects are and aren't universal about music and uses of music became really interesting to me too.
Hmm.
And then music's relationship to emotion, which is another area that I've obviously become interested in.
Wow.
Probably always was, but it became more prominent. And then aesthetics in general, because music is among the arts, but I always found, like the arts in general and specific arts fascinating in their own right, but fascinating for the way that they related to ideas and might express philosophical ideas, or the way philosophical ideas might be made more concrete by way of relating to art and aesthetic phenomena.
Right. Well, I mean, that is. God, you sure I can only get you for an hour, not 10 hours? But that's amazing. I mean, it reminds me of that Nietzsche quote, "We have art lest we perish from the truth." I think
Yes,
so
yeah.
spot on and so conducive to what you're describing here.
Mm,
So, okay, so let's go into that then. So I get a sense when I when I hear you talking there, Kathleen, I can't help but relate it to my own life, and I I can think of moments where I've been listening to a song that's evoked certain emotions, and then my philosophical understanding about how to live a good life is influenced by that.
mhm. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you say that because I wonder if how much of the way we see the world is actually guided by emotion and aesthetics in general. What were some of the big takeaways when you were studying aesthetics specifically in music?
Huh. Well, I guess one, that there is a kind of connection between making music with people and relating to people more generally. Um, because music actually does tap into the way we relate to the world on a lot of different levels, because there's a physical aspect to it, there's an emotional aspect to it, there's a mathematical aspect to it. Um, and like emotion itself, it tends to accumulate meaning, or bind things together. So I think that that's one of the ways in which music inevitably would have a kind of emotional character for us. It's so basic to the way we remember things. I mean,
Right.
rhythms at the very least, but songs, like people who have lost their memory in many respects still remember verses of songs that they learned in their childhood. Um, there's something just really very deep and basic about that. And so, I mean, I guess what would be the takeaway from all that? I guess that there's no surprise that music is as central to the way people live their lives as is the case, and that it's rather tragic that educators and others don't recognize its centrality more, or
Right.
the way in which music can bring people together. I mean, I think people know that, but on the other hand, in an era when we can listen to whatever music we want by ourselves,
Mm,
um, the the kind of social function that it used to have just obviously isn't as straightforward. And it seems that music becomes kind of a partisan possession. I mean, not meaning partisan in any
sure.
strict sense, but like, well, this generation can have this music.
Yep.
Like, this is ours, that's
Right.
yours. That seems really kind of strange. And I think that socially we just haven't caught up with the fact that we're using music so differently from the vast history
Mm,
before recording technology was widespread and available to everyone. And just what that means, and whether we're losing things or gaining things, probably both. But I think that it'll take a while for us to kind of catch up with that.
yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, you think music and arts therapy in general is becoming a
Mm,
therapy, which is really great. It's something I really love to speak to when I'm working with someone. And one of the ways I talk about it sort of touches on a lot of what you're describing here is, we all feel this existential aloneness. No matter
mhm.
how much we get to know someone, we're never really going to know what it's like to be them. Like Irvin Yalom talks about how we're all sort of lonely ships on a vast sea, but every
Uh-huh.
occasionally we can see someone else's light and we just sort of check in like, oh, you're there, are you? I'm here. And I think one of the really cool things that music does, and you kind of said this before, like it binds, right? We all move in rhythm to something that we're experiencing in the here and
Mhm.
now. And maybe what it's doing is not necessarily suppressing or helping us to forget that existential isolation, but allowing us just to have those brief moments of connectedness.
Yeah. Or even recognize that it's kind of an exaggeration to say we're, inside or, relating to the external world. I mean, they do
Mm.
run together,
Right,
and
right.
music reminds us of that. I think that's one of the things that made Nietzsche so interested in music when he would talk about it. I mean, he liked playing it too, but I think that the idea that, like it's more than a bridge between people, it's just kind of an indication that we're all dancing together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I never thought of it like that. But yeah, the way we listen to music now as an individualistic thing is sort of defeats the purpose in a way. Hopefully not, but I can see that.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, like one of the reasons that songs are so meaningful to people is that they feel like they really, that they're understood by somebody else who
Right.
has written a song about something that they've really felt.
Mm,
Um, so I think that I've read some studies about why people listen to sad music when they're sad, because a lot of people would think, well, you'd want to regulate your emotions. Like wallowing actually is an entertainment of a
right.
sort. And sometimes people don't recognize that. But when people talk about what they feel like they're getting out of sad music when they're sad, some of them talk about it as, kind of like a sort of companionship or a sense that they're with, they're understood
Right.
by at least someone in the world, maybe not the people right around them. And that I think is really valuable.
Yes. I mean, it can sometimes be the only thing that keeps someone around. I think that's such a
Yeah.
good point. It is a shame that we don't see music as valuable as it, it's just like you said, it's like it's entertainment, right? It's not healing. I mean, maybe, I mean, hopefully a lot of people see it as healing, but I don't suppose it's necessarily the primary way that we see it.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, recreation maybe does have a slightly better connotation than
Yes.
entertainment. But I mean, again, it does seem like that's something that we often tend to view as, sort of something that you can engage in if you've got the time.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Not supposing that the time really gains by recreation.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I interviewed a pod on the show a couple of months ago, and he this is actually quite a nice segue into your latest book, but he plays songs. He just brings his guitar and like his job is to sing to people in palliative care. So,
Huh,
people who are obviously on the precipice of dying,
right.
and he just sings to them and he says exactly like what you said before. Like some of them might have lost a lot of their memories, and yet you can see them sort of swaying to songs or having certain songs having a particular effect on them whereby the only reason he's playing them is because the family members have said, oh, they used to love this song back in the day or whatever it is. So there's
Yeah.
this, right? Um, but perhaps we could segue into your latest book. Before the show, I said, we were talking briefly on it. I think it's such an important book, as from what I've read from the plot. So I promise you, I'm going to read it, Kathleen. What gave you the inspiration to write a book on aesthetics and grief and loss?
Loss, of course. But quite a number of years ago, a philosophy professor who was also an art critic came to UT and gave a talk in which he was talking about some paintings that were very beautiful, but called elegies. And he was talking about how beauty seems somehow to, I don't know, be it creates a kind of significance and seems apt for something as basic as deep grief or a sense of mourning. And I'm sure that's one of the things that primed me to think about this. But when my late husband died, I was noticing how many people were relating to me in somewhat aesthetic ways. I mean, people would send flowers or do make these gestures, and they would seem gestural. or the idea of doing something that is sort of presentational and having rituals. And it just struck me that really we almost have no way of functioning without aspects of our way of relating to the world that would be obviously aesthetic in any other context. And the more I started looking at things that had an aesthetic aspect that were connected with grief and mourning, the bigger the list became. My dissertation advisor has written about the ethical significance of architecture, and one of his sentences in the book is, in paraphrase, that if you look back far enough in history, the history of architecture is essentially a history of tombs,
Mm,
because, like really massive building structures
right.
were designed to commemorate as much as they were to do anything else. And even when other functions took over, the commemorative aspect often remained a part of it. So he would point out that in many European churches where significant figures are buried, that's as much a part of the function of the church in some ways as just to house the living, because it makes them connected with other people who have passed on.
Mm,
And so I just started thinking about that, and then all the many ways in which the the arts, narrowly considered, but also um, aesthetics more broadly considered, touches on many of the ways that people who are grieving start to rebuild their lives. And so, yeah, that's kind of how that came to be. And then the kind of thing we were talking about in connection with songs, I've I found a lot of solace in some stories or films in which people had dealt with things maybe not exactly like I was dealing with, or maybe even obliquely a little bit connected with it, but nevertheless, they served as sort of guideposts. And so it just struck me that this was something worth drawing to people's attention.
yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things there that it's difficult, right, is that for something like grief, especially when it's like a husband or a, or a wife or someone that you love, a partner. And I'm so
Mhm.
sorry to hear that, by the way. When you go through something like that, you feel that no one can ever possibly understand what that's like, even though you might read of someone who was in a very similar situation, because that's sort of true. Like it is your subjective
Yeah.
experience, and no one will ever know. But is it good to know? Is it beneficial? Is it valuable that there are people who have experienced grief like what you're going through at the least to give you those guideposts in a way?
Well, I think it would be good if grief were kind of more socially um, out in the open.
Right.
And I guess one of the reasons that artworks are so useful is that in our societies, it isn't something that people make very obvious. And there is, like the wonders of medical science make it seem like something has gone wrong
Right.
if somebody dies. And the fact that it is not something, as in the past, that people are experiencing on a routine basis in their own families. But even when it happens in the family, most people go elsewhere to die, just
Mm.
makes people feel, I mean, I think it makes people very nervous. I mean, of course, people are nervous about dying, but um, they don't really know how to think about or feel about
Yeah.
grief. And certainly it's not something that is a socially welcome topic of conversation.
Right. Right.
So without artworks, I think we'd be kind of stuck for signposts, except in, really private conversations that many people might not have occasion to have.
Do you think that's because art gives people a sort of abstract representation of death and dying, which helps them because that means they don't have to touch it, face to face, so to speak, like,
Yeah.
but it's close enough for them to get a feel.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to explore emotional experience that yeah, it doesn't have to be what you're going through. I mean, like when people well-meaningly try to tell you what you're feeling, it's
Yes.
often done very well.
Yeah.
And in the case of somebody writing a novel or making a movie, no one is saying this is what you're feeling.
Right.
They're just putting out there that, you know, someone has felt this way.
Yeah.
And that that can that can be more of a bridge than trying to pinpoint what it is that a individual is feeling at any given point.
And I also think that what's so wonderful about art, if it's done well, especially in the context of grief and loss, is that if it's done well, then it's deeply vulnerable and deeply honest, and and
Hmm.
and it almost says, hey, look, nothing's off the table. Like I remember reading, I'm not sure if you've read A Matter of Death and Life by Irvin Yalom.
Oh, I haven't read it, no,
Oh, it's
but I obviously should because I love his work.
Yes, yeah, he's a real idol of mine, and that book was written by him and Marilyn as his wife, late wife now, was battling with cancer, and he
Mm.
finished the second half of the book with just him alone and his experiences with grief. Um, it is where is it? One of my favorite books, and I wish I should have prepared this. Um, there it is. Sorry for everyone listening. It's a pretty small book, so it's very digestible. But just a beautiful book, and one of the things I loved about it was that in his experience after she passed, and I think they'd been together since he was 14 or something
Oh,
insane. So
wow.
kind of, just to know someone your whole life,
Hmm.
he was so honest, which is why we love him so much, right? And he's talking about how he just can't suppress this newfound sexuality when he's
Hmm.
and which is actually quite common, but he goes into details about like you can't stop looking at women's breasts and all this sort of thing, and it's what I loved reading about that was that, like I said before, grief is so stigmatized because no one talks about it because it's painful to talk about. But when got
Hmm.
someone so honest to talk about it, you see that everything's on the table. You can have these
Yeah, yeah,
thoughts and it's fine.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that well, a a colleague that also writes about grief that I've talked with a lot, says that people really think they're going crazy. And that's another reason why people don't talk much about it because the people that are having the experience, even my own father was saying that he'd hesitated to tell me something. And I said, well, why? And he said, because I thought you'd think I was crazy.
Yep.
Well, that just comes with the territory, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're absolutely right. I think, yeah, trying to normalize all different sorts of funny thoughts that come up and different sort of proclivities and intuitions and things is so important. The concept of art as well, I think, is really good too, because and I'm sure you've probably experienced this and probably part of the reason why you wrote the book, but it gives you a sense of control and agency when
Oh,
you've
yeah.
feelings that are hard to manage.
Yeah. I mean, when my late husband died, I just started writing him letters because it seemed like that's a good form for communicating at a distance.
Right.
Like when you're writing a letter, people aren't there reading it.
Right.
um, and for me, that really helped a lot because it had kind of a customary form to it, um, but it still was moving it, moving it out in his direction, kind of streaming out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the mind has to recalibrate, it's very hard for the mind to sort of understand that someone can just not be here in time and space.
Yeah,
It's such an
yeah,
amazing tool. It's very strange.
yeah, right. I mean, I think that's why people go around, kind of expecting to see a person that they know they're not expecting to see, but nevertheless.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, no, thank you so much for writing that book, and yeah, I can't wait to read it. Um, Kathleen, I know that we're coming to the top of the hour, but there's a couple of things I'd love to speak to you about, just to say now in our modern culture. And we sort of touched on this briefly when we were speaking about what Nietzsche was gazing into with regard to what would occur in the future. And then
Mhm.
obviously without that unified, though authoritarian value structure, fascism occurred, and
Mhm.
communism occurred, and the death of millions and so on. And now we're in a almost a, and you would know this far better than me, but almost a postmodern culture where there seems to be this meta modernism now, where people are talking about, hey, maybe we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And postmodernism's great with its deconstructionist ideas, but we need to have some sort of objective reality. Otherwise, we're never going to get along. And there's going to be, I mean, what the hell's going on, right? So, what do you see? I mean, uh, coming into your career, I'm assuming sort of after the first wave of postmodernism, how's that changed, and what do you see sort of coming up for philosophy in general?
Well, um, no, I think postmodernism came after,
Oh,
but I mean, well, it depends on who you consider to be postmodern.
right.
Yeah, deconstruction was around, sure. Um, well, I think that there has to be an acknowledgement of different points of departure in a way that probably at least Western philosophy hasn't in the past paid so much attention to,
Mm, mm,
just because there was you know there were maybe vying schools of thought, but there was a lot that was presupposed and held in common. And now at least there's more recognition of other traditions and other starting points, um, whether just because people meet people who are coming from different places and
mhm.
thinking differently, but also I think on an academic level, people are much more aware of the Chinese tradition, the Indian tradition,
Right.
for example, than they have in the past. Not everybody is equally enthusiastic about paying a lot of attention to that. I mean, many people think I kind of veer, my error is on the opposite side of this. Some people think good to specialize, like talk about what you know. I sort of feel like, well, talk about anything at all. You don't
Yeah.
necessarily know anything, but
Yep.
uh, so I think that there will be a lot more interaction and interplay among different points of view, and that is to some extent happening now. I don't know in terms of people will have different views about what is desirable as an
Mm,
outcome. Some people are more comfortable with um, relativism, to use
yep.
the frightening word,
Right.
than
Right.
others. I think in practice, everyone is somewhat relativistic, at least in acknowledging that people do see the world differently. And while some people might claim that they think that everyone should should see the world the same way, I think they would, if pushed, really think that that's on fairly broad
Right.
themes that you might even get a lot of buy-in from various parties if you describe things in a general enough way. So yeah, I think I wouldn't I don't disagree with Nietzsche when he insists that everything is a matter of interpretation, but I don't think that he thought that we're just making up things whole cloth, or that there aren't some factors about the natural world and the nature of the bodies that we have and the kinds of recurrent experiences we have because we're mortal and age at a certain rate, and there's some predictable things that happen as a result of that. Um, it might be all in favor of many different configurations of families, but I think that he probably would acknowledge whatever reservations he had about his own, that um, some kind of kinship structure makes sense.
Mm.
So I think there really is a lot to build on that people really aren't seriously going to disagree about in very massive ways. Um, and then the question is, how much can we gain from really seeing the world in quite different ways, given this shared set of parameters? And how much do we need to have agreement before we can do much practically?
Right. And I think that's the issue that we're seeing. I mean, social media is its own sort of minefield, really. The way that it's just sort of prioritized as the most angry individual out there, right? But I think there's a really interesting conversation to have around, like, how morally relativistic can we be, despite the fact that we come from whatever these parameters are. And I just
Mm-hmm.
think part of the difficulty with this is, like, we don't necessarily have what those parameters are. If everything is a social
Yeah.
construction, there is no way that we are going to have a playing field where you and we can sort of agree to sort of move in a direction that we all want. It's interesting to me because I'm coming from a couples counseling perspective here, and I know that it gets more and more complicated as you broaden it out. But we know that for two people in a couple to be solutions focused and to thrive in a relationship over decades, they have to be sort of on the same path. People call that
Mhm.
similar values, similar goals, whatever it is, but there's this idea that they both want to get to the same place, really, whatever that is, because then it becomes about the how, and then that's the teamwork that's built into it, and then you can build the friendship and then the romanticism on top of that. But I think what's really difficult about our culture in this day and age is that, some of the interesting sort of stuff that the French postmodernists were describing is like, well, how much of this is actually socially constructed? Like that, they're really good conversations to have. But we're almost at a point now where it's become, at least in my opinion, where it's become
Mhm.
so recursive that we don't have any sort of objective truth to know, nothing that unifies us at all.
Hmm. Yeah. I wonder if that's really true or if we're just enjoying the the ability to disagree, which I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
is
yeah. That's a good point.
something worth considering. And also when you start factoring power dynamics into
Right.
it, which someone who's read Nietzsche for probably way too long is something that I always think about. Naturally, people are going to foreground what they disagree about, because I think theoretically it is the disagreeing that is often of interest. But if you're
Mm,
talking about doing things practically, of course, maybe that's another matter. And in practical terms, often I think people do, they may not have the same goal in terms of what they want society to look like, or, like how they think people ought to be using their time and so on. But I think often people just prioritize values that they genuinely recognize
mhm,
differently. So, for some people, the principle of the thing is really the bottom line. For other people, principles, like, yeah, they're good, but they're more rules of thumb.
mhm,
And, just that difference of way of approaching things can create all kinds of animosity
mhm,
when looking at, objectives, or, sort of recognizing, well, you do recognize that if you're a principled person, you do think that that ought to have some relationship to practical reality and vice versa. I think that can often be a useful sort of thing to discuss in terms of ideas in the public sphere. But, like entertainment value of news reports is going to emphasize things that are not where everybody is in agreement. And that encourages a state of kind of panic and, at
right.
least paranoia. So I think that's kind of what one of the problems that we're currently
Oh,
facing.
I couldn't agree more with you. It's funny, like I'm just at uni at the moment doing my master's, and everyone talks about how, universities and college campuses, I mean, you'd be able to speak to this, but they're just this cesspool of just horrible things going on. And I haven't experienced that at all. I've experienced like a wonderful really great people enjoying different ideas, and it's I think the problem is what people think is real based upon what social media tells us, as
I think
opposed to
that's true.
actually occurring.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, Kathleen, I thank you so much for your time. Just wrapping up here, what's coming up for you? Like perhaps there are some new subjects you guys are exploring in your coursework or new books that you're writing. What's on the agenda?
Immediately, I am giving a talk on existential aesthetics
Oh, right.
quite soon. And this is because someone else wrote about existential aesthetics as kind of an area, and I think that conference is going to be a lot of fun
Cool.
because it will be talking about aesthetics having real importance in people's lives and various ways in which that happens. So I'm excited about that. And in the fall, I'm going to teach a graduate seminar on Schopenhauer, one of Nietzsche's heroes whom he criticized constantly. Uh, so he's a good example of what we were talking about earlier. And I'm looking forward to just see, I mean, he's well known as being like the great pessimist of the Western tradition. So I'm curious to see how students respond and what it's like for me to reread Schopenhauer after not having been focused on him for a while.
Wow. Well, they sound amazing, and especially the existential aesthetics. That sounds really interesting. I mean, just within my soul, I'd be no, I don't know how I'd exist without writing.
Right.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Well, Kathleen, I'd love to have you on again. It was such a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, pleasure to speak with you.
Beautiful. Oh, and yes, of course, finally, where can people find you?
What do you mean?
Yeah,
They
good.
can't. They can find they I have an email address. They
Okay.
really can't find me.
No, well, that's a good thing. But perhaps like link where they could go to find some of your books is what I meant.
Oh, yeah, I do have a website through the University of Texas Philosophy Department.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I can put that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.